Chapter 3. Hooked. The entrance to the building site was crowded with construction workers preparing to go home. Alex was reminded of Brookfield an hour earlier. Nothing really changed when you got older, except that maybe you weren't given homework. The men and women drifting out of the site were tired, in a hurry to be away. That was probably why none of them tried to stop Alex as he slipped in among them, walking purposefully as if he knew where he was going, as if he had every right to be there. But the shift wasn't completely finished yet. Other workers were still carrying tools, stowing away machinery, packing up for the night. They all wore protective headgear, and seeing a pile of plastic helmets, Alex snatched one up and put it on. The great sweep of the block of apartments that was being built loomed up ahead of him. To pass through it, he was forced into a narrow corridor between two scaffolding towers. Suddenly, a heavy-set man in white overalls stepped in front of him, blocking his way. "Where are you going?" he demanded. My dad." Alex gestured vaguely in the direction of another worker and kept walking. The trick worked. The man didn't challenge him again. He headed toward the crane. It stood in the open, the high priest of construction. Alex hadn't realized how very tall it was until he reached it. The supporting tower was bolted into a massive block of concrete. It was very narrow. Once he squeezed through the iron girders, he could reach out and touch all four sides. A ladder ran straight up the centre. Without stopping to think, Alex began to climb. "It's only a ladder," he told himself. "You've climbed ladders before. You've got nothing to worry about." But this was a ladder with 300 rungs. If Alex let go or slipped, there would be nothing to stop him from falling to his death. There were rest platforms at intervals, but Alex didn't dare to stop to catch his breath. Somebody might look up and see him, and there was always a chance that the barge, loose from its moorings, might begin to drift. Alex knew he had to hurry. After 250 rungs, the tower narrowed. Alex could see the crane's control cabin directly above him. He looked back down. The men on the building site were suddenly very small and far away. He climbed the last ladder. There was a trapdoor over his head leading into the cabin, but the trapdoor was locked. Fortunately, Alex was ready for this. When MI6 had sent him on his first mission, they'd given him a number of gadgets — he couldn't exactly call them weapons — to help him out of a tight spot. One of these was a tube marked ZitClean for healthier skin. But the cream inside the tube did much more than clean up pimples. Although Alex had used most of it, he had managed to hold on to the last remnants and often carried the tube with him as a sort of souvenir. He had it in his pocket now. Holding onto the ladder with one hand, he took the tube out with the other. There was very little of the cream left, but Alex knew that a little was all he needed. He opened the tube, squeezed some of the cream onto the lock, and waited. There was a moment's pause, then a hiss and a wisp of smoke. The cream was eating into the metal. The lock sprang open. Alex pushed back the trapdoor and climbed the last few rungs. He was in. He had to close the trapdoor again to create enough floor space to stand on. He found himself in a square metal box, about the same size as a sit-in arcade game. There was a pilot's chair with two joysticks, one on each arm, and instead of a screen, a floor-to-ceiling window with a spectacular view of the building site, the river, and the whole of West London. A small computer monitor had been built into one corner, and at knee level there was a radio transmitter. The joysticks beside the arms were surprisingly uncomplicated. Each had just 6 buttons, 2 green, 2 black, and 2 red. There were even helpful diagrams to show what they did. The right hand lifted the hook up and down. The left hand moved it along the jib, closer or farther from the cabin. The left hand also controlled the whole top of the crane, rotating it 360 degrees. It couldn't have been much simpler. Even the start button was clearly labelled. A big switch for a big toy. He turned the switch and felt power surge into the control cabin. The computer lit up with a graphic of a barking dog as the warm-up program spun into life. Alex eased himself into the operator's chair. There were still 20 or 30 men on the site. Looking down between his knees, he saw them moving silently far below. Nobody had noticed that anything was wrong, but still he knew he had to move fast. He pressed the green button on the right-hand control, green for go, then touched his fingers against the joystick and pushed. Nothing happened. Alex frowned. Maybe it was going to be more complicated than he thought. What had he missed? He rested his hands on the joysticks, looking left and right for another control. His right hand moved slightly, and suddenly the hook soared up from the ground. It was working. Unknown to Alex, heat sensors concealed inside the handles of the joysticks had read his body temperature and activated the crane. All modern cranes have the same security system built into them, in case the operator has a heart attack and dies. There can be no accidents. Body heat is needed to make the crane work. And luckily for him, the crane was a Liebherr 154 ECH, one of the most modern in the world. The Liebherr is incredibly easy to use, and also remarkably accurate. Even sitting so high above the ground, the operator can pick up a tea bag and drop it into a small china pot. Now Alex pushed sideways with his left hand and gasped as the crane swung around. In front of him he could see the jib stretching out, swinging high over the rooftops of London. The more he pushed, the faster the crane went. The movement couldn't have been smoother. The Liebherr 154 has a fluid coupling between the electric motor and the gears so that it never jolts or shudders. It glides. Alex found a white button under his thumb and pressed it. The movement stopped at once. He was ready. He would need some beginner's luck, but he was sure he could do it, provided nobody looked up and saw the crane moving. He pushed with his left hand again, and this time waited as the jib of the crane swung all the way round past Putney Bridge and over the River Thames. When the jib was pointing directly at the barge, he stopped. Now he manoeuvred the cradle with the hook using his other hand. First, he slid it right to the end of the jib. Then he lowered it, quickly to begin with, more slowly as it drew closer to ground level. The hook was solid metal. If he hit the barge, Skoda might hear it, and he would have given himself away. Carefully now, 1 inch at a time. Alex licked his lips, and using all his concentration, took careful aim. The hook crashed onto the deck. Alex cursed. Surely Skoda would have heard it, and would even now be grappling with the door. Then he remembered the boombox. With luck, the music would have drowned out the noise. He lifted the hook, at the same time dragging it across the deck toward him. He had seen his target. There was a thick metal stanchion welded into the deck at the near end. If he could just loop the hook around the stanchion, he would have caught his fish. Then he could reel it in. His first attempt missed the stanchion by more than a foot. Alex forced himself not to panic. He had to do this slowly, or he would never do it at all. Working with his left and right hands, balancing one movement against the other, he dragged the hook over the deck and then back toward the stanchion. He would just have to hope that the boombox was still playing and that the sliding metal wasn't making too much noise. He missed the stanchion a second time. This wasn't going to work. No, he could do it. It was the same as the game at the amusement park, just bigger. He gritted his teeth and manoeuvred the hook a third time. This time, he saw it happen. The hook caught hold of the stanchion. He had it. He looked down. Nobody had noticed anything wrong. Now, how do you lift? He pulled with his right hand. The hook tightened. The cable became taut. He actually felt the crane take the weight of the barge. The whole tower tilted forward alarmingly, and Alex almost slid out of his seat. For the first time he wondered whether his plan was actually possible. Could the crane lift the barge out of the water? What was the maximum load? There was a white placard at the end of the crane arm, printed with a measurement. 3,900 kg. Alex made a quick calculation. That was about 5 tons. Surely the boat couldn't weigh that much. He glanced at the computer screen. One set of digits was changing so rapidly he was unable to read them. They were showing the weight that the crane was taking. What would happen if the boat was too heavy? Would the computer initiate an automatic cut-off, or would the whole thing just fall over? Alex settled himself in the chair and pulled back, wondering what would happen next. Inside the boat, Skoda was opening a bottle of gin. He'd had a good day, selling more than $150 worth of merchandise to the kids at his old school. And the best thing was, they'd all be back for more. Soon he'd sell them the stuff only if they promised to introduce it to their friends. Then the friends would become customers too. It was the easiest market in the world. He'd gotten them hooked. They were his to do with as he liked. The fair-haired man working with him was named Beckett. The two had met in prison and decided to go into business together when they got out. The boat had been Beckett's idea. There was no real kitchen and no toilet, and it was freezing in winter. But it worked. It even amused them to be so close to a police station. Sometimes they enjoyed watching the police cars or boats going past. Of course, the pigs would never think of looking for criminals right on their own doorstep. Suddenly Beckett swore. What is it? Skoda looked up. The cup! Skoda watched as a cup of coffee, which had been sitting on a shelf, began to move. It slid sideways, then fell off with a clatter, spilling cold coffee on the grey rag they called a carpet. Skoda was confused. The cup seemed to have moved on its own. Nothing had touched it. He giggled. "How'd you do that?" he asked. "I didn't." Then the fair-haired man was the first to realise what was happening, but even he couldn't guess the truth. "We're sinking!" he shouted. He scrabbled for the door. Now Skoda felt it for himself. The floor was tilting. Test tubes and beakers slid into each other, then crashed to the floor, glass shattering. He swore and followed Beckett uphill now. With every second that passed, the gradient grew steeper. But the strange thing was that the barge didn't seem to be sinking at all. On the contrary, the front of it seemed to be rising out of the water. "What's going on?" Skoda yelled. "The door's jammed." Beckett had managed to open it an inch, but the wire on the other side was holding it firm. "Check the other door." But the second door was now high above them. More bottles rolled off the table and smashed. In the kitchen, dirty plates and mugs slid into each other, pieces flying. With something between a sob and a snarl, Skoda tried to climb up the mountainside that the inside of the boat had become. But it was already too steep. The door was almost over his head. He lost his balance and fell backward, shouting as 1 second later the other man was thrown on top of him. The two of them rolled into the corner, tangled up in each other. Plates, cups, knives, forks, and dozens of pieces of scientific equipment crashed into them. The walls of the barge were grinding with the pressure. A window shattered. A table turned itself into a battering ram and hurled itself at them. Skoda felt a bone snap in his arm and screamed out loud. The barge was completely vertical, standing in the water at 90 degrees. For a moment it rested where it was. Then it began to rise. Alex stared at the barge in amazement. The crane was lifting it at half speed. Some sort of override had come into action, slowing the operation down. But it wasn't even straining. Alex could feel the power under his palms. Sitting in the cabin with both hands on the joysticks, his feet apart and the jib of the crane jutting out ahead of him, he felt as if he and the crane had become one. He had only to move an inch, and the 5-ton boat would be brought to him. He could see it, dangling on the hook, spinning slowly. Water was streaming off the bow. It was already clear of the water, rising up about 5 yards per second. He wondered what it must be like inside. And then the radio beside his knee hissed him to life. "Crane operator, this is base. What the hell do you think you're doing? Over." A pause, a burst of static. Then the metallic voice was back. "Who is in the crane? Who's up there? Will you identify yourself?" There was a microphone snaking toward Alex's chin, and he was tempted to say something, but he decided against it. Hearing a teenager's voice would only panic them more. He looked down between his knees. About a dozen construction workers were closing in on the base of the crane. Others were pointing at the boat, jabbering amongst themselves. No sounds reached the cabin. It was as if Alex were cut off from the real world. He felt very secure. He had no doubt that more workers had already started climbing the ladder, and that it would all be over soon. But for the moment, he was untouchable. He concentrated on what he was doing. Getting the barge out of the water had been only half his plan. He still had to finish it. "Crane operator, lower the hook. We believe there are people inside the boat and you are endangering their lives. Repeat, lower the hook." The barge was almost 200 feet above the water, swinging on the end of the hook. Alex moved his left hand, turning the crane around so that the boat was dragged in an arc along the river and then over dry land. There was a sudden buzz. The jib came to a halt. Alex pushed the joystick. Nothing happened. He glanced at the computer. The screen had gone blank. Someone at ground level had come to his senses and done the only sensible thing. He had switched off the power. The crane was dead. Alex sat where he was, watching the barge swaying in the breeze. He hadn't quite succeeded in what he'd set out to do. He had planned to lower the boat, along with its contents, safely into the parking lot by the police station. It would have made a nice surprise for the authorities, he had thought. Instead, the boat was now hanging over the conference centre that he had seen from Putney Bridge. But at the end of the day, he supposed it didn't make much difference. The result would be the same. He stretched his arms and relaxed, waiting for the trapdoor to burst open. This wasn't going to be easy to explain. And then he heard the tearing sound. The metal stanchion that protruded from the end of the deck had never been designed to carry the entire weight of the barge. It was a miracle that it had lasted as long as it had. As Alex watched, open-mouthed, the stanchion tore itself free. For a few seconds, it clung by one edge to the deck. Then the last metal rivet came loose. The 5-ton barge had been 60 yards above the ground. Now it began to fall. In the Putney Riverside Conference Centre, the chief of the Metropolitan Police was addressing a large crowd of journalists, TV cameramen, civil servants and government officials. He was a tall, thin man who took himself very seriously. His dark blue uniform was immaculate, with every piece of silver, from the studs on his epaulets to his 5 medals, polished until it gleamed. This was his big day. He was sharing the platform with no less a personage than the Home Secretary himself. The Assistant Chief of Police was there, as well as 7 lower-ranking officers. A slogan was being projected onto the wall behind him. "Winning the war against drugs." Silver letters on a blue background. The Chief of Police had chosen the colours himself, knowing that they matched his uniform. He liked the slogan. He knew it would be in all the major newspapers the next day, along with, just as important, a photograph of himself. "We've overlooked nothing," he was saying, his voice echoing around the modern room. He could see the journalists scribbling down his every word. The television cameras were all focused on him. "Thanks to my personal involvement and efforts, we have never been more successful." He smiled at the Home Secretary, who smiled toothily back. "But we are not resting on our laurels. Oh no. Any day now, we hope to announce another breakthrough." That was when the barge hit the glass roof of the conference centre. There was an explosion. The Chief of Police just had time to dive for cover as a vast, dripping object plunged down towards him. The Home Secretary was thrown backward, his glasses flying off his face. His security men froze, helpless. The boat crashed into the space in front of them between the stage and the audience. The side of the cabin had been torn off, and there was the laboratory exposed, with the 2 dealers sprawled together in one corner, staring dazedly at the hundreds of policemen and officials who now surrounded them. A cloud of white powder mushroomed up, and then fell onto the dark blue uniform of the police chief, covering him from head to toe. The fire alarms had all gone off, the lights blew out, then the screaming began. Meanwhile, the first of the construction workers had made it to the crane cabin and was gazing astonished at the 14-year-old boy he found there. "Do you," he stammered, "do you have any idea what you've just done?" Alex glanced at the empty hook and at the gaping hole in the roof of the conference centre, at the rising smoke and dust. He shrugged apologetically. "I was just working on the crime figures," he said, "and I think there's been a drop." Chapter 4. Search and Report. At least they didn't have far to take him. 2 men brought Alex down from the crane, one above him on the ladder and one below. The police were waiting at the bottom. Watched by the incredulous construction workers, he was marched away from the building site and into the police station just a few doors away. As he passed the conference centre, he saw the crowds pouring out. Ambulances had already arrived. The Home Secretary was being whisked away in a black limousine. For the first time, Alex was seriously worried, wondering if anyone had been killed. He hadn't meant it to end like this. Once they got to the police station, everything happened in a whirl of slamming doors, blank official faces, whitewashed walls, forms, and phone calls. Alex was asked his name, his age, his address. He saw a police sergeant tapping the details into a computer, but what happened next took him by surprise. The sergeant pressed enter and visibly froze. He turned and looked at Alex, then hastily left his seat. When Alex had entered the police station, he had been the centre of attention, but suddenly everyone was avoiding his eye. A more senior officer appeared. Words were exchanged. Alex was led down a corridor and put into a cell. Half an hour later, a female police officer appeared with a tray of food. "Supper," she said. "What's happening?" Alex asked. The woman smiled nervously but said nothing. "I left my bike by the bridge," Alex said. "It's all right. We've got it." She couldn't leave the room fast enough. Alex ate the food. Sausages, toast, a slice of cake. There was a bunk in the room, and behind a screen, a sink and a toilet. He wondered whether anyone was going to come in and talk to him, but nobody did. Eventually he fell asleep. The next thing he knew, it was 7 o'clock in the morning. The door was open, and a man he knew all too well was standing in the cell looking down at him. "Good morning, Alex," he said. "Mr. Crawley." John Crawley looked like a junior bank manager, and when Alex had first met him, he had indeed been pretending that he worked for a bank. The cheap suit and striped tie could both have come from the Macy's boring businessman section. In fact, Crawley worked for MI6. Alex wondered if the clothes were a cover or a personal choice. "You can come with me now," Crawley said. "We're leaving." "Are you taking me home?" Alex asked. He wondered if anyone had been told where he was. "No, not yet." Alex followed Crawley out of the building. This time there were no police officers in sight. A car with a driver stood waiting outside. Crawley got into the back with Alex. "Where are we going?" Alex asked. "You'll see." Crawley opened a copy of the Daily Telegraph and began to read. He didn't speak again. They drove east, through the city, and toward Liverpool Street. Alex knew at once where he was being taken, and sure enough, the car turned into the entrance of a 17-storey building near the station and disappeared down a ramp into an underground parking lot. Alex had been here before. The building pretended to be the headquarters of the Royal and General Bank. In fact, this was where the Special Operations Division of MI6 was based. The car stopped. Crawley folded away his paper and got out, ushering Alex ahead of him. There was an elevator in the basement, and the two of them took it to the 16th floor. "This way," Crawley gestured at a door marked 1605. The gunpowder plot, Alex thought. It was an absurd thing to flash into his mind, a fragment of the history homework he should have been doing the night before. Guy Fawkes had tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament in the year 1605. Oh well, it looked as if the homework was going to have to wait. Alex opened the door and went in. Crawley didn't follow. When Alex looked around, the man was already walking away. "Shut the door, Alex, and come in." Once again, Alex found himself standing opposite the prim, unsmiling man who ran MI6. Grey suit, grey face, grey life. Alan Blunt seemed to belong to an entirely colourless world. He was sitting behind a wooden desk in a large square office that could have belonged to any business anywhere in the world. There was nothing personal in the room, not even a picture on the wall or a photograph on the desk. Even the pigeons pecking on the windowsill outside were grey. He was not alone. Mrs. Jones, the head of Special Operations, was with him, sitting on a leather chair, wearing a mud-brown jacket and dress, and, as always, sucking a peppermint. She looked up at Alex with black, bead-like eyes. She seemed to be more pleased to see him than her boss was. She was the one who had spoken. Blunt had barely registered the fact that Alex had come into the room. Then Blunt looked up. "I hadn't expected to see you again so soon," he said. "That's just what I was going to say," Alex replied. There was a single empty chair in the office. He sat down. Blunt slid a sheet of paper across his desk and examined it briefly. "What on earth were you thinking?" he demanded. "This business with the crane. You've done an enormous amount of damage. You've practically destroyed a $3 million conference centre. It's a miracle nobody was killed." "The 2 men who were in the boat will be in the hospital for months," Mrs. Jones added. "You could have killed the Home Secretary," Blunt continued. "That would have been the last straw. What were you doing?" "They were drug dealers," Alex said. "So we've discovered, but the normal procedure would have been to call the police." "I couldn't find a phone," Alex sighed. "They turned off the crane," he explained. "I was going to put the boat next to the police department, on the doorstep." Blunt blinked once and waved a hand as if dismissing everything that had happened. "It's just as well that your special status came up on the police computer," he said. "They called us, and we've handled the rest." "I didn't know I had special status," Alex said. "Oh yes, Alex. You're nothing if not special." Blunt gazed at him for a moment. "That's why you're here." "So you're not going to send me home?" "No. The fact is, Alex, that we were thinking of contacting you anyway. We need you again." "You're probably the only person who can do what we have in mind," Mrs. Jones added. "Wait a minute." Alex shook his head. "I've still got 2 weeks of school before Easter. I'm far enough behind as it is. Suppose I'm not interested?" Mrs. Jones sighed. "We could, of course, return you to the police," she said. "As I understand it, they were very eager to interview you." "And how is Miss Starbright?" Blunt asked. Jack Starbright. Alex still didn't know if the name was short for Jackie or for Jacqueline, was the housekeeper who'd been looking after Alex since his uncle had died. She was a bright, red-haired American girl who'd come to London to study law, but had never left. Blunt wasn't interested in her health, Alex knew that. The last time they'd met, he'd made his position clear. So long as Alex did as he was told, he could keep living in his uncle's apartment with Jack. Step out of line, and she'd be deported to America. Alex liked Jack. For 10 years, she'd almost been like a big sister to him. He also needed her. He knew that he was too young to live on his own, and that once she was out of the picture, the authorities would have custody of him. That would mean some grim institution in the north of England. Blunt had made that clear, too. "Have you told Jack where I am?" he asked. "Of course. She doesn't seem to like the idea of our, employing you. Actually, I must remember to get her to sign the Official Secrets Act. I wouldn't want her talking to the wrong people." Mrs. Jones took over. "Come on, Alex," she said. "Why pretend you're an ordinary schoolboy anymore?" She was trying to sound more friendly, more like a mother, but even snakes have mothers, Alex thought. "You've already proven yourself once," she went on. "We're just giving you a chance to do it again." "It'll probably come to nothing," Blunt continued. "It's just something that needs looking into, what we call a search and report." "Why can't Crawley do it?" "We need a boy." Alex fell silent. He looked from Blunt to Mrs. Jones and back again. He knew that neither of them would hesitate for a second before pulling him out of Brookland, taking him away from his friends, and sending him wherever. Anyway, wasn't this what he'd been asking for only the day before? Another adventure? Another chance to save the world? "All right," he said. "What is it this time?" Blunt nodded at Mrs. Jones, who unwrapped another peppermint and began. "I wonder if you know anything about a man called Michael J. Roscoe?" she asked. Alex thought for a moment. He was that businessman who had an accident in New York. He'd seen the news on TV. Didn't he fall down an elevator shaft or something? "Roscoe Electronics is one of the largest companies in America," Mrs. Jones said. "In fact, it's one of the largest in the world. Computers, videos, DVD players, everything from cell phones to washing machines.
Roscoe was very rich, very influential, and very clumsy, Alex cut in. It certainly seems to have been a very strange and even careless accident, Mrs. Jones agreed. The elevator somehow malfunctioned. Roscoe didn't look where he was going. He fell into the shaft and died. That's the general opinion. However, we're not so sure. Why not? First of all, there are a number of details that don't add up. On the day Roscoe died, a maintenance engineer by the name of Sam Green called at the office building on 5th Avenue where Roscoe worked. We know it was Green, or someone who looked very much like him, because we've seen him. They have closed-circuit security cameras, and he was filmed going in. He said he'd come to look at a defective cable, but according to the company that employed him, there was no defective cable, and he certainly wasn't acting under orders from them. Why don't you talk to him? We'd like to, but Green has vanished without a trace. We think he may have been killed. We think someone may have taken his place and somehow set up the accident that killed Roscoe. Alex shrugged. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about Mr. Roscoe, but what's it got to do with me? I'm coming to that. Mrs. Jones paused. The strangest thing of all is that the day before he died, Roscoe telephoned this office. A personal call. He asked to speak to Alan Blunt. I met Roscoe at Cambridge University, Blunt said. That was a long time ago. We became friends. That surprised Alex. He didn't think of Blunt as the sort of man who had friends. What did he say? He asked. Unfortunately, I wasn't here to take the call, Blunt replied. I arranged to speak with him the following day. By that time, it was too late. Do you have any idea what he wanted? I spoke to his assistant, Mrs. Jones said. She wasn't able to tell me very much, but she understood that Roscoe wanted to talk to us about his son. He had a 14-year-old son, Paul Roscoe. A 14-year-old son. Alex was beginning to see the way things were going. Paul was his only son, Blunt explained. I'm afraid the two of them had a very difficult relationship. Roscoe divorced a few years ago, and although the boy chose to live with his father, they didn't really get along. There were the usual teenage problems. But of course, when you grow up surrounded by millions of dollars, these problems sometimes get amplified. Paul was doing badly at school. He was playing hooky and spending time with some very undesirable friends. There was an incident with the New York police. Nothing serious, and Roscoe managed to hush it up. But still, it upset him. I spoke to Roscoe from time to time. He was worried about Paul and felt the boy was out of control, but there didn't seem to be very much he could do. So is that what you want me for? Alex interrupted. You want me to meet this boy and talk to him about his father's death? No. Blunt shook his head and handed a file to Mrs. Jones. She opened it. Alex caught a glimpse of a photograph, a dark-skinned man in military uniform. Remember what we told you about Roscoe, she said, because now I want to tell you about another man. She slid the photograph around so that Alex could see it. This is General Major Viktor Ivanov, ex-KGB. Until last December, he was the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service and probably the second or third most powerful man in Russia after the president. But then something happened to him too. It was a boating accident on the Black Sea. His cruiser exploded. Nobody knows why. Was he a friend of Roscoe's? Alex asked. They probably never met. But we have a department here that constantly monitors world news, and their computers have thrown up a very strange coincidence. Ivanov also had a 14-year-old son, Dmitri, and one thing is certain. The young Ivanov certainly knew the young Roscoe because they went to the same school. Paul and Dmitri? Alex was puzzled. What was a Russian boy doing at school in New York? He wasn't in New York. Blunt took over. As I told you, Roscoe was having trouble with his boy. Trouble at school, trouble at home. So last year he decided to take action. He sent Paul to Europe, to a place in France, a sort of finishing school. Do you know what a finishing school is? I thought it was the sort of place where rich people used to send their daughters, Alex said, to learn table manners.
That's the general idea. But this school is for boys only, and not just ordinary boys. The fees are $15,000 a term. This is the brochure here. You can have a look.
He passed a heavy square booklet to Alex. Written on the cover, gold letters on black, were 2 words: Point Blank.
It's right on the French-Swiss border, he explained. South of Geneva, just above Grenoble, in the French Alps. It's pronounced Point Blanc.
He spoke the words with a French accent.
Literally, White Point. It's a remarkable place, built as a private home by some lunatic in the 19th century. As a matter of fact, that's what it became after he died. A lunatic asylum. It was taken over by the Germans in the Second World War. They used it as a recreation centre for their senior staff. After that, it fell into disrepair until it was bought by the current owner, a man called Grief, Dr. Hugo Grief. He's the principal of the school.
Alex opened the brochure and found himself looking at a colour photograph of Point Blanc. Blunt was right. The school was like nothing he'd ever seen. Something between a German castle and a French chateau, straight out of a Grimm's fairy tale. But what made Alex draw his breath, more than the building itself, was the setting. The school was perched on top of a mountain, with nothing but mountains all around, a great pile of brick and stone surrounded by a snow-covered landscape. It seemed to have no business being there, as if it had been snatched out of an ancient city and accidentally dropped there. No roads led to or from the school. The snow continued all the way to the front gate. But looking again, Alex saw a modern helicopter pad projecting over the battlements. He guessed that it was the only way to get there and to leave. He turned another page. "Welcome to the Academy at Point Blanc," the introduction began. It had been printed with the sort of lettering Alex would expect to find in the menu of an expensive restaurant. "A unique school that is much more than a school, created for boys who need more than the ordinary education system can provide. In our time, we have been called a school for problem children, but we do not believe the term applies. There are problems and there are children. It is our aim to separate the two."
"There's no need to read all that stuff," Blunt said. "All you need to know is that the Academy takes in boys who've been expelled from all their other schools. There are never very many of them there, just 6 or 7 at a time, and it's unique in other ways too. For a start, it takes only the sons of the super-rich."
"At $15,000 per term, I'm not surprised," Alex said.
"You'll be surprised just how many parents have applied to send their sons there," Blunt went on. "But I suppose you've only got to look at the newspapers to see how easy it is to go off the rails when you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth. It doesn't matter if they're politicians or pop stars. Fame and fortune for the parents often bring problems for the children, and the more successful they are, the more pressure there seems to be. The Academy went in business to straighten the young people out, and by all accounts, it's been a great success."
"It was established 20 years ago," Mrs. Jones said. "In that time it's had a client list you'd find hard to believe. Of course they've kept the names confidential, but I can tell you that parents who have sent their children there include an American vice president, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, and a member of our own royal family." "As well as Roscoe and this man Ivanov," Alex said. "Yes." Alex shrugged. "So it's a coincidence, just like you said. 2 rich parents with 2 rich kids at the same school. They're both killed in accidents. Why are you so interested?"
"Because I don't like coincidence," Blunt replied. "In fact, I don't believe in coincidence. Where some people see coincidence, I see conspiracy. That's my job."
"And you're welcome to it," Alex thought. What he said was, "Do you really think the school and this man, Grief, might have had something to do with the 2 deaths? Why? Had the parents forgotten to pay the fees?" Blunt didn't smile.
"Roscoe telephones me because he's worried about his son. The next day the man's dead. We've also learned from Russian intelligence sources that a week before he died, Ivanov had a violent argument with his son. Apparently Ivanov was worried about something. Now do you see the link?"
Alex thought for a moment. "So you want me to go and look into this school?" he said. "Well, how are you going to manage that? I don't have parents, and they were never rich anyway." "We've already arranged for that," Mrs. Jones said, and Alex realised that she must have made her plans before the business with the crane ever happened. Even if he hadn't drawn attention to himself, they would have come for him. "We're going to supply you with a wealthy father. His name is Sir David Friend." "Friend? As in Friend's Supermarkets?" Alex had seen the name often enough in the newspapers. "Supermarkets, department stores, art galleries, soccer teams." Mrs. Jones paused. "Friend is certainly a member of the same club as Roscoe, the Billionaires Club. He's also heavily involved in government circles as personal advisor to the Prime Minister. Very little happens in this country without Sir David being involved in some way."
"We've created a false identity for you," Blunt said. "From this moment on, I want you to start thinking of yourself as Alex Friend, the 14-year-old son of Sir David. You've been expelled from Eton. You have a criminal record, shoplifting, vandalism, and possession of drugs. Sir David and his wife Caroline don't know what to do with you, so they've enrolled you in the academy, and you've been accepted."
"Well, isn't school vacation about to start?"
"They don't have official vacations. The school is open all year round."
"And Sir David has agreed to all this?" Alex asked. Blunt sniffed.
"As a matter of fact, he wasn't very happy about it, about using someone as young as you. But I spoke to him at some length, and yes, he agreed to help."
"So when am I going to the academy?" 5 days from now," Mrs. Jones said. "But first you have to immerse yourself in your new life. When you leave here, we've arranged for you to be taken to Sir David's home. He has a house in Lancashire. He lives there with his wife, and he has a daughter. She's 1 year older than you. You'll spend the rest of the week with the family, which will give you time to learn everything you need to know. It's vital that you have a strong cover. After that, you'll leave for Grenoble." "And what do I do when I get there?" "We'll give you a full briefing nearer the time. Essentially, your job is to find out everything you can. It may be that this school is perfectly ordinary and that there was in fact no connection between the deaths. If so, we'll pull you out. But we want to be sure." "How will I get in touch with you?" "We'll arrange all that." Mrs. Jones ran an eye over Alex, then turned to Blunt. "We'll have to do something about his appearance," she said. "He doesn't exactly look the part."
"See to it,"
Blunt said. Alex sighed. It was strange, really. He was simply going from one school to another, from a London comprehensive to a finishing school in France. It wasn't quite the adventure he'd been hoping for. He stood up and followed Mrs. Jones out of the room. As he left, Blunt was already sifting through his documents, as if he'd forgotten that Alex had been there, or even existed.